Welcome back to Flight Sim School. Today we're going to be looking at everything related to a short field landing. We'll be looking at when we would do a short field landing as well as how we would actually go about doing one. So there are two reasons why you would want to use a short field landing procedure. The first one is if you're landing at a runway that's about 1.5 to 2 times the minimum distance required for your plane to land. So let's say your plane requires around 500 feet in order to land safely. If the runway is anything less than around 1,000 feet, you're going to want to use that short field procedure to make sure that you have enough place to safely land and come to a full stop before running out of runway. The other reason you would do a short field approach is if there's an obstruction near the beginning of the runway. There may be trees near the beginning of the runway if you're landing at an airstrip that's a little bit more remote and isn't as well maintained. Naturally, the obstruction that's there is going to cut down on the amount of space you're going to have available to you to land. So you really need to make sure that you've got enough space to come in at a slightly steeper angle and then still safely get down on the runway and come to a complete stop. Alright, so let's have a look at how a short field landing differs from a normal landing. So the main difference that you need to keep an eye on is your airspeed. In a normal landing, there's a lot more leeway in terms of your final approach speed. You don't have to be perfect with it. So long as you're within a certain range, you'll be able to get down on the runway and not overshoot the runway at all. But with a short field, you need to be much more gentle and much more in tune with what's actually happening with the plane. If you're coming in too fast, you're going to end up overshooting the field and you won't have enough time to get down on the ground and to a complete stop. On the opposite side, if you're coming in too slow and you don't have enough power, you're at risk of stalling and losing a lot of altitude quickly and potentially not having enough time to recover because you're coming in for a landing. There won't be much place for you to adjust. We haven't looked at stalls yet, but we will look at them soon. For now, all you need to know is that a stall is a bit different than a stall you would have in your car. In the car, when you stall, the engine will actually stop. On the other hand, when you stall in the plane, the engine continues running, but you're going to end up losing a lot of altitude very quickly because the nose is going to pitch down. So all that said, it's really important to master the throttle control when you're doing the short field landing. You want to make very small adjustments, either increases or decreases, and see how the plane reacts and make sure that you maintain the proper airspeed the whole way down to the runway. Things get even more complicated when there's an obstruction like some trees near the end of the runway. You're going to need to descend at a steeper angle to avoid slamming into those trees, which means your plane is naturally going to want to fly faster. So it makes everything just that wee bit more complicated. Let's have a look at that in more detail. So this is a shot of what the runway where we're going to be landing in a couple minutes looks like. As you can see, there are trees right there obstructing the end of the runway. Those trees make it impossible to use a normal descent rate down to the runway. If you did try and do that, you would end up slamming into either the top or the middle of those trees before you ever even get to the runway. So what you do instead is you come down at a slightly steeper descent angle. And that's what's portrayed in the two images that you see in front of you right now. So the image on the left represents a normal descent rate that, like we just said, would basically get you in the trees, and a steeper descent rate on the right hand side that will allow you to avoid the trees and duck in just past them and come in for a landing. Which of course brings us back to the previous point of what I was saying about controlling your airspeed on the descent. It becomes very important because of that obstruction. Once you get past it, you're going to have even less runway than you normally would. The best way to judge your descent rate is to actually look at the angle that the runway is forming in front of you. So on the left, which is the normal descent rate, you can see that the runway feels a little bit more squished. You see a lot more of the front of the runway and a lot less of it as it moves further away from you. On the other hand, if you look at the steeper descent angle, you see a lot more of the runway. Whether you're looking at the start of it or if you're looking more towards the end of it, you can see it a lot better. It's a lot more stretched out. That's what a steeper descent angle should look like. So to summarize, keep an eye on your airspeed regardless of if there's an obstruction or not. And when there is an obstruction, you need to keep an eye on your airspeed. Plus, you need to have that steeper descent angle to make sure that you're going to avoid those trees that are waiting for you at the end of the runway. Alright, that's enough theory for now, so let's jump in the plane and put these short field landing procedures to work for us. Alright, so here we are on final approach. I've paused the game just to make it a little bit easier to go over everything that's going to happen in quick succession as we come in for the landing. I used slew mode to get myself into position. If you're not familiar with slew mode, I recommend you look it up when you're practicing these types of scenarios. It can be quite fun to just take that shortcut to get yourself in the right position, unpause the game, and just resume your flight from there, rather than having to go around and do a full circuit. So the runway ahead of us is well over 1,000 feet. It's actually 2,000 feet, but we're still going to do our short field landing so that we can get our practice in. Our goal will be to land on the first half of that runway. There are no obstructions for this first landing, so we'll just use our normal descent rate that we saw in the theory section. So in the Cub, the recommended configuration for a short field landing is to use full flaps. At full flaps, the stall speed of the plane is 62 kilometers an hour. So we'll want to keep our airspeed somewhere between 10 and 15 knots above that 62 kilometers an hour, just to make sure we've always got a little bit of leeway if things get away from us a little bit, which when you're just starting out, it tends to do. So what is going to happen is we are going to unpause the game and we'll slowly start our descent. We'll probably need around a 200 feet per minute descent rate or so. You can keep an eye on that with the vertical speed there or just with the altimeter as you prefer. In terms of power, we'll make slight adjustments, very slight adjustments to maintain that descent rate and keep an eye on our airspeed as well. Once again, once we cross the runway threshold, we'll reduce that power to idle and let the plane come down onto the runway. Once we've landed, I'll start applying the brakes, and I'll also apply a little bit of back pressure on the stick to make sure that the back of the plane doesn't flip over itself. And that's something that can happen if you're hitting the brakes too hard. The front of the plane isn't moving as quickly as the back, so the back tail wants to come up and over, and you can end up in a really bad situation. As you'll see, I'm not a pro at this either, but if you keep practicing this skill, you will get better at it. I probably practiced this landing a dozen times or so in preparation for this recording, so you'll see even with 12 recordings, I'm still not fantastic at it. Alright, with all that said, I think we're ready to give this a go. So I've got the flaps already in the arrival position, and I will put them into the final position in a second once we get moving. Our airspeed is alright, so I'm ready to come off the active pause. So I'm just going to unpause the game, and what I'm going to try and do is maintain a nice 200 feet per minute descent rate, try and keep that runway centered, keep that airspeed as slow as possible. So I'm going to put full flaps now, maintain the descent rate. So you saw the plane wanted to pitch up there. That's because initially increasing the flaps actually increases the lift, but then the drag takes over. Alright, that descent rate's looking good. Airspeed's coming up a bit low. Just a wee bit more power. You really need very minor throttle adjustments to maintain your descent rate and your airspeed. That's looking good. I think my descent rate's looking good. I may be slightly high, but I'll take it. Holding the throttle right around there is good. Nice and smooth. Right. So I'm a little high there. Reduce power a bit. Right, we've crossed the threshold. Coming in a little bit longer than I would have hoped. And a little bit harder than I would have hoped. There we go. So now I'm hitting the brakes and I am holding the slightest amount of back pressure on the stick so that the tail, goes down ever so slightly. And then I come to a complete stop. So we ended up taking about 1,000 feet or so, about half of the runway length. So if this actually had been a runway of around 1,000 feet, which is what we were talking about at the beginning of this video, we would have just made it. As you saw, I came in that wee bit too high there at the end. However, I think in the circumstances it was all right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to reset the flight and we are going to try the same thing but with an obstruction. Alright, so we are back on final here and we are just about ready to give it a go with the obstruction at the end of the runway. So because of those trees at the end of the runway, what we're going to have to do is come in at that slightly more aggressive descent rate. That increased descent rate is going to want to increase the speed of the plane, so what we're going to do to adjust for that is use even less power than we did on the last approach to come in at about the same speed, about 10 to 15 knots above stall speed of 62 kilometers an hour with the full flaps down. Speaking of which, I will at least put the first degree of flaps and I will put the second one just as soon as we get moving. So as I descend, I'll try and keep that steeper descent rate that we were looking at in the theory section to avoid those trees that we're going to see in a couple of seconds as we get moving. Similar to last time, once I cross the runway threshold, I'll reduce power to idle and let the plane come to a rest on the runway. Once we've touched down, I'm going to hit the brakes and use slight back pressure on the stick to make sure that the back of the plane doesn't want to come forward. Alright, with all that said, let's give it a go. So I will unpause, and I will hold our altitude until we get a little bit closer so that we get the descent rate that we're looking for of around 500 or so feet per minute. So our airspeed's nice there at 50 knots. I'll recall our stall speed of 62 kilometers an hour, so we're well over that. Right. So we're coming up on the runway there. We're going to start our descent soon, and that's when things are going to start to happen much more quickly. I gave myself a long final just so that I had enough time to go over all the details with you guys. Normally you wouldn't have this long of a final, but you might want to take a slightly longer final when you're doing a short field approach just to give yourself that little bit of extra leeway. So now that we're pitching down to maintain that steeper descent rate, I'm reducing power. I'm going to increase the flaps to the landing flaps and just fight that little bit of lift. The initial lift that gets generated. Alright, there we go. And now we're going to hold that 500 or so feet per minute. Keep an eye on that airspeed. I added just a touch of power. Make sure we stay above our stall speed. There we go. Our descent rate is fairly stable at around 500 feet per minute. You can see that angle that the runway is making is staying pretty stable, which is always a good sign that you've got a stable descent rate. And you can always rely on the vertical speed as well, but try and look out the window first. There we go. So we're looking good now to get past those trees, those pesky little trees there. Reduce power just that wee bit more. So we're still a little high, but we've cleared the trees. We've passed the threshold, so I will Reduce power to idle. Let us come to a slow descent. Increase power there because we were just about to stall. Let her land like that. Alright, now I'm hitting the brakes and applying that back pressure. And there we go. We cut it a little bit close there by coming in that wee bit higher, but as you can see, we still landed on the first half of the runway, which was our objective. So I hope you learned something useful with these 2 demonstration flights. And again, as usual, if there's any questions or comments, please make sure to leave them below. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again next time. Alright, bye-bye!